Welcome to part 21, where we're looking at the Gospel of Matthew. I've entitled this Reality and the Miraculous. Let's just reflect back on where we've been in the last presentation, where we asked the question, why parables? Why did Jesus teach in parables? It's a meaningful story, but the meaning is not on the surface. You've got to think it through. You've got to work at it. So it requires effort, not intellectual. It's nothing to do with being clever. It's being willing to think through the implications of what the story means. And that leads to a range of reactions in different peoples. At one end, there were those who could get deep insights from the stories Jesus told, while at the other end, it made no sense. Just a story. It depends on your spiritual willingness to listen, to think it through, to look for the meaning, to search. Now, it's a spiritual willingness. It's not a cleverness willingness. So it's open to everyone. The stories were simple. They were straightforward. But the meaning has multiple levels of depth, which we can access depending on our spiritual willingness to search and ask questions. So parables separate those who just see them as stories, right across to those who can look below the surface, who are willing to look below the surface and see in them wonderful insights and provocative challenges. It's a great way to teach. We people remember stories. So you can think about the story again and again and again. You remember it because it has a sequence, it's a story. But the levels of the depths of meaning can keep on increasing the more we think about it. It's a wonderful way of communicating ideas. Now, these were parables that Matthew's brought together, parables that Jesus gave about the kingdom of heaven. Now, we could draw about 8 conclusions from this. This is a Western way of thinking. Speaks about true response to the message of the kingdom. Commitment brings persecution. Speaks about the scale of growth of the kingdom, from insignificance to significance. They speak about the nature of the growth, which is hidden but incredibly powerful. Speaks about the fact that Satan generates counterfeits and it's very difficult to distinguish them. We can only see it in the end by the quality of the living of the people concerned. Speaks about the consequences of rejecting the kingdom or coming into the kingdom. Speaks about the wonder of the kingdom. Come into the kingdom, make it top priority, single-mindedly. Opens doors of potential that are incredible. Speaks about an enemy who prevents access and indeed counterfeits membership. And it speaks about the need to look afresh again and again and again. Principles are established based on Old Testament principles, but there are new levels of depth that we can keep on accessing. Now there's the 8. But if I switch this frame off, it'd be interesting if you tried to see how many of these 8 you could remember. Not a very efficient way of looking at things. You see, the way of parables is much more efficient. We remember the stories, and we can mentally recount them, and we get the meanings again and again and again at increasing depth. A wonderful way to teach, particularly in an age which was an oral age, where people didn't read and write in general. Parables are a powerful way to communicate. This set of parables, parables of the kingdom, It pictures the kingdom of Jesus, which is not like any other kingdom. It's a hidden kingdom, a spiritual world, a world where people take a decision. You and I invited to take the decision. We want to go the way of Jesus. We want to come into his lifestyle. We want to receive his power. We want to follow him. He is the king, a spiritual king. It has no structure. It has no organization. It is no rule book system. It's completely unlike any other kingdom in life. And it grows under the radar. It's unseen because it grows in human beings. And human beings share it with each other. And that leads to endless expansion. It leads to quality living, and it draws in and attracts others in. And there are wonderful consequences from being in the kingdom, but sadly, very tragic consequences of rejecting the way of the kingdom. We lose out in this life, and we lose out in the long run. Parables of the kingdom. That gives us a broad brush picture of what Jesus was driving at. Difficult for the people then to grasp, difficult for people in our Western culture today to grasp. An unseen spiritual world where we have chosen to make Jesus king and are seeking to follow him. Parables of the kingdom. Now we move into a strange world of reality and the miraculous. So often in our Western cultures today, the miraculous is dismissed. And people tend to pretend that reality, what you can see, touch and feel, is the only thing that's important. Jesus presents here a picture that's something rather different. Starts there in chapter 13. Jesus had completed these parables, and he moves on from there. He physically moves. He goes back to his hometown Nazareth. He began teaching the people in their synagogue, and they were amazed. Where did this man get this wisdom and these miraculous powers? They asked. Isn't this the carpenter's son? Isn't his mother's name Mary? And aren't his brothers James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas? Aren't all his sisters with us? Where then did this man get all these things? And they took offense at him. But Jesus said to them, a prophet is not without honor except in his own town and his own home. And he did not do many miracles there because of their lack of faith. He had made his base Capernaum, which was on trade routes and good communications. He goes back to a visit to Nazareth, speaking in the synagogue. And the people there, they couldn't cope with this. Here was Jesus, one of their own group, back. He'd been brought up in the village. His father was the local carpenter. His mother was there. She'd had numerous other children, brothers and sisters, to Jesus. They were there. He was just one of them. But that's what made the impact. He had a level of wisdom and understanding of spiritual things. And he was able to bring about the most amazing healing miracles. And he was just one of their own group. So they couldn't cope. They didn't see beyond that. He was just the local boy come good, with his younger brothers and sisters still there. But that's what it led to, and that's what it still leads to today. The word faith has nothing to do with intellectually screwing up your ability to try and believe something that's irrational and unreal. Faith is a word of action. It just means a response. were willing to take Jesus seriously and respond accordingly. They weren't willing to take Jesus seriously. He was just the local boy, the son of the carpenter, now a young man. They couldn't see beyond that. And they wouldn't come to him for healing. They didn't want to know. So miracles just didn't happen. Miracles can happen when we are prepared to respond to Jesus, to take him seriously and act accordingly. A positive response. And that is an important message for our Western societies today. His teaching confronted the social norms of his society. He had a depth of understanding that blew their minds, not intellectual, but spiritual. His lifestyle was of transparent goodness. He wasn't in it for himself. He wasn't on the make. He didn't seek power. He didn't push people around. We could go on. And miracles were happening all around him. In days where illness was a disaster, there was no health service. There was almost no medicine. Illness meant poverty and perhaps starvation. He released people from all that oppressed them. And it blew their mind. It blew the mind of all the people who met Jesus. What kind of man is this? Is what his disciples said. How can he do this? Where does it come from? What's the drive all about? Wherever Jesus is presented, then there's a reality that he provokes challenge. He disturbs our way of thinking. He disturbs our cozy lifestyle. He makes us ask questions. He provokes. That's reality. Jesus provokes challenge. At that time Herod the Tetrarch heard the reports about Jesus, and he said to his attendants, "This is John the Baptist. He's risen from the dead. That is why miraculous powers are at work in him." Now Herod had arrested John and bound him and put him in prison because of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife. For John had been saying to him, "It is not lawful for you to have her." Herod wanted to kill John, but he was afraid of the people because they considered John a prophet. On Herod's birthday, the daughter of Herodias danced for the guests and pleased Herod so much that he promised with an oath to give her whatever she asked. Prompted by her mother, she said, "Give me here in a dish the head of John the Baptist." The king was distressed, but because of his oaths and his dinner guests, he ordered that her request be granted, had John beheaded in the prison. His head was brought in a dish and given to the girl, who carried it to her mother. John's disciples came and took his body and buried it. Then they went away and told Jesus. When Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. Herod had had John the Baptist executed. The story is gruesome. His wife no doubt resented John's criticism of her marriage to Herod. John had been imprisoned in one of Herod's palaces further south. Of course, in those days news took a while because it had to be carried by people, and the followers of John came and told Jesus. It shook Jesus, and he went away on his own to ponder it through and to pray about it. The Herod here is a Herod called Herod Antipas, a thoroughly unsavoury character. He was the son of the Herod that existed around the events of the birth of Jesus and who'd killed all the infant boys in Bethlehem. But Herod had only inherited part of the kingdom that his father had ruled. And he resented it. And he resented that it had been divided up amongst the brothers. Now Herod Antipas had ruled from about 4 BC to 39 AD. And he took his brother's wife as his own wife, forcing his brother to divorce her. But Herod was already married and he had to divorce his own wife. Again, a very thoroughly messed up, tragic set of circumstances. His father-in-law, who was a powerful ruler further to the northeast, started a fairly disastrous war on Herod's territory in resentment at what he had done to his daughter. And John had made it clear to Herod Antipas that all this was morally wrong and called him to put it right. And Herod was quite happy if John had been executed, but John was a popular figure in these early days, so Herod put him in prison, hoping that his popularity would die down, he could get rid of him, and of course the excuse that came through his daughter allowed him to have John executed. Now John was a relative of Jesus. They knew each other. And the events disturbed Jesus. Now just ponder this for the moment. Herod was now generating this fictional explanation that Jesus was John the Baptist come back from the dead. That meant that Herod was going to be after Jesus next, if he thought he was John the Baptist reincarnated. And that would mess up the program that Jesus had to fulfill. Jesus did not want to be locked up in a prison where he could not complete his ministry working with people. And Jesus knew his way was the way of the cross. So he withdrew. Events seemed to be moving too fast. And Jesus had to reduce his profile so that he could complete all he had to do. He had a group of disciples and followers to train. He had many people to reach, many people to be healed, and then he would move south, where he would be tortured and executed. He didn't want Herod to interfere with that by locking him up too quickly. The reality of what Jesus was up against. Truth and integrity challenge the corruption of wider society, and it generates persecution. And then in the middle of this, we have this remarkable story of the feeding of the 5,000. Now, it's the only miracle that's told in all 4 New Testament accounts in such depth. It made a huge impact. And the events are quite consistent. That's the standard Jewish formula. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which were written around the same time, the pictures of a miracle where Jesus met the needs of the people. John, more reflective, links it to the statement, I am the bread of life, meeting the needs of the people at a deeper level. They all note this remarkable outcome. and they all note that Jesus dismisses the crowd. The disciples set off in a boat, and Jesus retires to pray. He wanted to withdraw. He needed time on his own. He had to rethink things through. He had to seek the Father's will. He needed to rethink the timing so that his mission could be fulfilled in the way God wanted, without interference from Herod. There's the map of the Sea of Galilee, an inland lake caught in hills. Because of the geography of the land, storms can blow up quite quickly, funneled by the valleys and the hills round about. The healing of the 5,000, the healing unlimited there, where Jesus met the needs of all the people, and the feeding of the 5,000, somewhere about there. Jesus stays behind to pray. He wants to be on his own. But the disciples set off to go back to the home base of Capernaum. He sends them back. A storm blows up, and the wind blows them off course. Now, some of the disciples were experienced fishermen on the Sea of Galilee, but this was some storm and they were scared. So the boat is driven south, and somewhere in the early hours of the morning, Jesus comes to them walking on the water. Of course, boats in those days were entirely dependent on the wind or oars. The wind was driving them off course, and they didn't have enough strength with the oars to bring them onto the correct direction. He comes to them walking on the water. Just imagine yourself in the boat, scared stiff, and you see Jesus coming out of the darkness on the water. It raises some amazing questions. Why did Peter try to walk on the water? He was an impulsive man, incredibly impressed by Jesus, and he wanted to do what Jesus was doing. Why did Jesus encourage him? To draw out his faith, to draw out his willingness to take a risk, to draw out his willingness to trust Jesus. And Peter succeeded at the beginning because he was trusting Jesus. Jesus was doing it. He'll help me to do it. That was the way Jesus had taught the disciples. He'd shown them what to do and encouraged them to copy and develop it depending on the Holy Spirit. They were apprentices. But then he failed. Doubt, maybe. He looked around and saw the problems of the storm. His mind got in the way and he thought, well, humans can't walk on water. The reaction of Jesus, he guided him back to the boat. You see, faith is a word of action. It's not a word of intellect. And it means trusting in the right person. Faith means trusting something or someone. But if we trust in water to keep us up, we'll sink. If we trust in Jesus to keep us up, we'll stand strong. Faith means responding to Jesus. And Jesus wanted to stretch Peter's faith. He wanted to stretch the faith of all his followers. He wants to stretch your faith and mine. He wants to enable us to respond to him more completely, more wholeheartedly. He wants to stretch our spiritual muscles and help us depend on him and know that he will see us through. And no doubt Peter over the years would reflect back on the events of the storm, and probably all the other disciples would as well, and remember what Jesus had done and how he had drawn them out and beyond themselves. If you remember back to when Jesus was baptized, John the baptizer had been told, "The one on whom you see the Holy Spirit descend and remain, that's the Messiah." That's the characteristic of Jesus as a human being. He depended on the Holy Spirit totally. And our faith is stretched when we learn to depend on the Holy Spirit more and more and more. Reality and the miraculous. The storm was real enough, and when it was calmed by Jesus, there was a strong reaction. The wind died down when Peter and Jesus climbed into the boat, and those who were in the boat worshipped him. It's a kind of word there, worship, that means bowed down before, bowed the head. Truly you are the Son of God. Now that phrase carries enormous depth of meaning. Truly you are the Son of God. You are the one who reflects the nature and the power of God totally and completely. Not a biological son, spiritual son. You are the Son of God. And through these events, these followers of Jesus beginning to grasp more of who Jesus really was and his impact for the human race. Mark records it this way, but he ties it back to the miracle where Jesus had fed the 5,000. Their hearts were hardened. They didn't get it. So while they were beginning to grasp that Jesus was the Son of God, filled with all the fullness, nature, and power of God, they had not fully understood why Jesus had come, not just to feed the people, not just to heal the people, but to restore the people spiritually, to open the doors of the kingdom and invite people in. These followers of Jesus were struggling to get who Jesus was and what he was doing. Back to our map. That's where they ended up. They'd been driven south, so they went to the next village down the coastline. When they crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret. When the men of that place recognized Jesus, he had some reputation by now, they sent word to all the surrounding country. People brought all who were ill to him and begged him to let those who were ill just touch the edge of his cloak, and all who touched it were healed. People were desperate for help in an age where there was no answer to ill health, no answer to the tragedies of all that Satan was doing in people's life, destroying them through disease. They flocked to hear him. They saw Jesus as someone who could answer their problem. But that's significant. If you go through the whole of Matthew's Gospel, indeed all 4 Gospels, no one who ever came to Jesus wanting healing was turned away. All were healed. The problem is, if you look back to the reality of what happened in Nazareth previously, They didn't want the healing because they just saw Jesus as the local boy growing up. They didn't want to come for healing, so it didn't happen. And that is the key still today. Those who come, who respond to Jesus genuinely, all were healed. That's the miraculous in the reality of the mess of our lives. So let's just look at reality and miracles, as it were, side by side. Back in his hometown, they didn't take him seriously. These people had watched him grow up. They'd watched him work with his father. They watched him with the younger brothers and sisters around. The family, a typical artisan family in a backwater in the Roman Empire. They couldn't see beyond that. And the reality of his relative being executed brutally under cruel circumstances. Was he to be next? That his work would be cut off prematurely. That's the reality. And yet the miraculous was all around. Near Bethsaida he healed all who came to him. He calmed a storm. And all who came to him were healed near Gennesaret, on the shores of the lake. The reality of the difficult mess of our human existence placed alongside the miraculous power of Jesus to transform lives and circumstances, to enable us to cope and to move forward. Reality and the miraculous come together. And the only thing that limits the power of Jesus is us. Because we don't accept that he can do it. We limit Jesus. We put him in a box. We see him as a great teacher. We see him as a powerful leader. We see him as the local boy made good. And we don't grasp that he's the Son of God. God entered our humanity, limiting himself by choice in a human body. But in that life, Jesus drew from all the power of God, the nature of God, because he was God. And the power of God and the Holy Spirit allowed miracles to happen that transformed the reality of our lives into something greater and more wonderful. Son of God, he carried within him the fullness of the nature and power of God, depending totally on the Holy Spirit. Thus he was able to meet every need, but we had to come to him believing he could meet our need. We had to want his help, to seek his help. He was in control, even of the weather. After all, as God, he'd made the universe. But that's the tragedy. The religious leaders, they wanted to get rid of him because he disturbed their cozy religious systems. The political leaders like Herod wanted to get rid of him because he disturbed his immoral lifestyle. And Jesus today still does that. He is rejected by those so often in power religiously and politically because he disturbs our power base and our desire to control things. But it can often be rejected by the ordinary folk in life. We think we can run our lives our own way. We know how to do it. We know better. And history shows what a mess we humans make of it. And that rejection limits the power of Jesus to help us and to bring the transformation that he wants to release to humanity. Reality and the miraculous. And that is true in life. Throughout the world today, there are brutal realities where ordinary people are suffering horrendously at the hands of religious and political leadership. But alongside that, there are the wonderful miracles of transformation. As Jesus comes and we seek his help, and lives are transformed, healing is released, and we're able to cope with life's brutalities. Reality and the miraculous, what a picture of contrasts Matthew has painted for us. But it's true to life. And Jesus went through the anguish of knowing that his close relative had been executed brutally. But he moved on to fulfill what God had for him to do. And in the next presentation, we'll look at the strange picture of insiders and outsiders.